From the very first moment you became aware of the world, you were likely taught a simple assumption. Reality already exists out there, solid, fixed, independent of you. Mountains stand whether you see them or not. Time moves forward whether you notice it or not. The universe, according to this view, is a finished stage, and consciousness merely observes the play. But what if that assumption is incomplete? Modern physics, neuroscience, and centuries of contemplative traditions are quietly converging on a different possibility. Not that the world is imaginary, but that reality, as you experience it, may be inseparable from the act of observing it. Every sunrise you witness is not just light hitting your eyes. It is perception organizing energy into meaning. Every sound, every sensation, every memory appears not outside awareness, but within it. You have never actually experienced a world apart from consciousness. You have only experienced the world as it appears in consciousness. This is a subtle shift, yet it changes everything. Quantum physics introduced one of the most intriguing insights of the last century. At the smallest measurable scales, matter does not behave like solid objects until it is observed. Before measurement, particles exist as probabilities, waves of potential rather than fixed things. Only when observation occurs does a specific outcome emerge. Scientists call this the observer effect. Philosophers call it participation. Mystics simply call it awareness. Different languages, same mystery. If observation influences physical outcomes at the quantum level, it raises a profound question. Is consciousness merely watching reality, or is it part of how reality takes shape? Notice your own experience for a moment. Right now, thoughts are appearing, sensations are present. Perhaps sounds in the environment, the feeling of your body, subtle emotional tones. All of this is happening within awareness, and yet awareness itself remains quiet, unchanged behind the movement. You are not just inside reality. Reality, as you know it, is unfolding inside perception. This doesn't mean you control everything you experience. Quantum physics doesn't suggest that personal will dominates the universe. Instead, it points toward participation, a relationship between observer and observed that is dynamic rather than separate. Think of the ocean and its waves. A wave has a recognizable shape, a beginning and an end, yet it never exists apart from the ocean itself. In the same way, individual experience may be a localized expression of a much larger field of consciousness. Many physicists refer to this as the unified field, the underlying continuum from which matter, energy, and possibly awareness emerge. While science continues to investigate its nature, the implication is already striking. Separation may be more about perception than reality, and when that insight begins to settle, something subtle happens. The universe stops feeling like a distant place you must navigate, and starts feeling like a living process you are already participating in. Not as a controller, but as an observer whose awareness matters. As you begin to question the nature of observation, another layer gradually comes into focus: the idea of separation. It feels obvious that you are here, inside your body, while the world exists out there, independent and distant. This assumption is so deeply ingrained that it rarely gets examined. Yet it may be one of the most fundamental filters shaping human experience. Interestingly, separation is not something we are born fully perceiving. Early in life, before language stabilizes perception, experience is more fluid. Infants respond to colors, movement, sound, and sensation as a continuous field rather than as clearly divided objects. The boundaries between self and world develop gradually as naming begins. Language is powerful. It allows coordination, memory, culture, and science. But it also divides. The moment something receives a label, tree, sky, body, other, perception subtly shifts from wholeness to distinction. What was once a seamless flow becomes categorized into parts. This division is practical, but it also creates the persistent feeling of being a separate observer moving through an external reality. Quantum physics complicates this picture. Experiments repeatedly show that observation cannot be cleanly separated from what is observed. Measuring a system changes it. The observer participates whether intentionally or not. Reality at its most fundamental level appears relational rather than independent. From this perspective, consciousness is not outside the universe looking in. It is part of the same dynamic process through which the universe expresses itself. You can notice a reflection of this in everyday experience. Two people can encounter the exact same situation, a conversation, an opportunity, a challenge, yet their realities feel completely different. One experiences threat, another possibility. One perceives rejection, another neutrality. The event may be similar, but the experienced reality diverges based on perception. This isn't merely psychological interpretation. It points to how awareness selects, filters, and organizes information continuously. Out of infinite sensory data, you perceive only what resonates with your attention, expectations, and emotional state. In that sense, perception is not passive recording, it is active construction. The more rigid the sense of separation becomes, the more life can feel like negotiation with an unpredictable external world. Safety, belonging, meaning. They seem located somewhere outside, requiring effort to obtain. This often generates anxiety, comparison, and the feeling of being slightly out of place. But if observation is participatory rather than detached, the relationship shifts. Reality becomes less like an obstacle course and more like an interaction. Consider how differently the world feels when you are calm versus stressed. The external environment may not change significantly, yet perception transforms the entire experience. Time feels slower or faster. Opportunities appear or disappear. Conversations flow or become strained. This suggests something subtle but important. Awareness doesn't just register reality. It shapes the version of reality you encounter, not through force, through resonance. And as this understanding deepens, the rigid boundary between observer and observed begins to soften. The world no longer appears entirely external. Instead, it starts to feel like a mirror, not always comfortable, but continuously responsive. A mirror not only reflecting what is seen, but participating in how it is seen. One of the most intriguing discoveries in modern physics emerged from an experiment so simple it almost feels philosophical. Scientists directed tiny particles, electrons, photons, toward two narrow openings known as slits. Based on classical physics, these particles should have behaved like miniature bullets, passing through one slit or the other in predictable paths. But something unexpected happened. When unobserved, the particles behaved not like solid objects, but like waves, patterns of probability spreading across space. Instead of a clean impact pattern, the results showed interference, as if each particle had traveled multiple paths simultaneously. Reality, at that scale, appeared fluid, undefined. Then came the surprising part. When measuring devices were introduced to observe which slit each particle passed through, the wave pattern disappeared. The particles behaved like discrete objects again. Observation itself seemed to influence how matter expressed itself. This became known as the observer effect. Importantly, physicists do not claim that human thought magically creates particles. Rather, measurement, interaction with the system, alters its state. Yet the philosophical implications remain profound. Observation cannot be separated from reality. The act of looking is part of what shapes what appears. This insight begins at the quantum level, but its echoes extend into human experience. Perception is never neutral. Attention highlights certain aspects of reality while leaving others in the background. Emotional states further tune perception. Fear narrows awareness toward potential threats. Curiosity expands it toward possibility. Gratitude shifts focus toward connection. The external world may remain complex and multidimensional, but the version you experience emerges through the lens of observation. Consider how expectations influence encounters. When you anticipate conflict, subtle signals confirming that expectation become more noticeable. When you anticipate cooperation, different cues stand out. This is not necessarily self-deception. It reflects how the nervous system prioritizes information aligned with current mental and emotional states. Neuroscience refers to this as predictive processing. The brain continuously anticipates what it expects to perceive and then filters incoming data accordingly. Reality, as experienced, becomes a dialogue between external input and internal expectation. In a sense, observation collapses possibility into experience, not absolutely, but meaningfully. This participatory relationship does not imply total control. Natural forces, biological processes, and external events continue to operate beyond personal intention. Yet awareness influences how those events are perceived, integrated, and responded to, which in turn shapes future outcomes. Artists intuitively understand this. A photographer does not create the landscape, but reveals a particular version of it through framing, timing, and perspective. Likewise, consciousness frames experience continuously, selecting what becomes foreground and what remains background. The deeper implication is quietly empowering. You are not merely a spectator of reality. You are a participant. Every moment of attention, every emotional tone, every interpretation subtly contributes to the reality you experience next. Not as absolute authorship, but as relational influence. And as this becomes clearer, another question naturally arises. If observation shapes experience, what shapes the observer? As the observer effect invites us to reconsider the role of perception, physics itself begins pointing towards something even more expansive. The possibility that beneath all apparent separation exists a continuous field connecting everything. Einstein spent much of his later life searching for what he called a unified field, a single underlying framework from which all forces and particles emerge. While the complete theory remains unfinished, modern physics increasingly suggests that what we call matter may not be solid in the way it appears. At fundamental scales, it behaves more like organized energy within a continuous field. This insight subtly reshapes how we understand existence. Instead of isolated objects interacting across empty space, reality may resemble patterns arising within an interconnected medium. Much like waves forming on the surface of an ocean, distinct forms appear temporarily while remaining inseparable from the underlying field. Interestingly, contemplative traditions across cultures have described something similar for thousands of years. Different names, different metaphors, unified field, Brahman, Tao, universal consciousness, yet all pointing toward a foundational continuity beneath diversity. Science approaches this through measurement and theory. Mysticism approaches it through direct experience. Increasingly, the two perspectives seem less opposed than once assumed. If such a field exists, the implications for perception are significant. You are not simply an isolated observer inside a vast universe. You are a localized expression of the same field you observe. The boundary between self and world becomes less absolute, more functional than fundamental. You can sense hints of this in everyday experience. Emotion spreads between people almost instantly. Calm presence stabilizes a room. Anxiety can ripple through a group without words. These phenomena are partly neurological, mirror neurons, hormonal signaling, but they also suggest a subtler level of resonance operating continuously. Biology itself reflects this interconnectedness. The human body is not a fixed object but an ongoing process. Cells are replaced, particles exchanged with the environment, energy flowing constantly. The boundary of the body is dynamic, not static. Even breathing demonstrates this. Each inhale integrates the external environment into your internal system. Each exhale returns something of you back into the world. Separation becomes less rigid when viewed through process rather than object. From a unified field perspective, consciousness may function similarly. Rather than being produced solely inside the brain, it may arise through interaction between organism and field, a relationship rather than a location. This idea remains scientifically debated, yet its experiential resonance is unmistakable. Moments of deep stillness, creativity, or awe often bring a sense of connection that transcends ordinary self-definition, not loss of individuality, but expansion of context. You remain yourself, but yourself feels less confined. Understanding reality as an interconnected field doesn't erase challenges or uncertainties. Instead, it reframes them. Life becomes less about navigating a hostile external environment and more about participating in a dynamic relational system. And participation invites coherence, because if everything arises within a connected field, then the state of the observer may influence not only perception, but resonance within the field itself. For a long time, the dominant scientific view held that consciousness is produced entirely by the brain. According to this model, neural activity generates thoughts, emotions, identity, and awareness itself. The brain would be the origin point, the place where subjective experience emerges from biological complexity. This perspective has brought enormous insight, especially in neuroscience and medicine. Yet as research deepens, some questions remain unresolved. How exactly does electrical and chemical activity produce subjective awareness? Why does experience exist at all, rather than just mechanical processing? Increasingly, some scientists and philosophers are exploring an alternative possibility. What if the brain does not create consciousness, but receives, filters, and expresses it? A useful analogy is the radio receiver. When music plays from a radio, it may seem as though the sound originates inside the device. But opening it reveals circuits, not musicians. The signal exists in the electromagnetic field, and the radio translates it into audible form. Similarly, the brain might function as a biological receiver, translating broader fields of information into thoughts, perceptions, and identity. This idea remains controversial, yet several observations keep it in discussion. States such as deep meditation, creative flow, or profound emotional coherence often correlate with synchronized brainwave patterns rather than increased chaotic activity. Coherence appears to facilitate clarity. Neuroscience describes these states through alpha, theta, and gamma synchronization, rhythmic alignment across neural networks. Subjectively, people report heightened awareness, insight, or interconnectedness during such periods. The implication is subtle but important. Clarity may arise less from producing more mental activity and more from reducing internal noise. You can observe this directly. When the mind is overloaded, stress, constant stimulation, unresolved emotion, perception narrows. Decision-making becomes reactive. Creativity feels blocked, but when attention settles, even briefly, perception often widens without additional effort. The environment hasn't necessarily changed, the receiver has. This perspective also reframes intuition. Many breakthroughs in science, art, and innovation appear not through step-by-step reasoning, but through sudden insight. Einstein described some discoveries as intuitive leaps. Artists often speak of ideas arriving fully formed. Rather than constructing everything from scratch, the mind may sometimes be tuning into patterns already present within a broader informational field. Whether one interprets this scientifically, philosophically, or spiritually, the experiential implication is practical. The quality of attention influences the quality of perception. If consciousness operates partly as reception, then emotional and cognitive coherence become forms of tuning. Fear, resentment, or chronic distraction may introduce interference. Calm curiosity, sincerity, and openness may enhance clarity. This is not about forced positivity. Authentic awareness, including acknowledging discomfort, often produces more coherence than suppression. Gradually, the mind shifts from constant production to sensitive reception. And when that happens, something interesting emerges. You begin to notice that awareness itself feels more fundamental than the thoughts appearing within it. which raises the next question naturally. If consciousness is the field in which experience appears, how does observation shape the reality that follows? If consciousness may function partly as a receiver, the role of observation becomes even more interesting. Observation is not only about noticing what already exists, it may also influence which possibilities become visible in your experience. Quantum mechanics illustrates this at microscopic scales. Before measurement, particles exist in probability states, not fixed outcomes, but ranges of potential. When measured, one specific result appears. Physicists describe this as the collapse of the wave function. Importantly, this does not mean human intention directly commands particles. Rather, interaction itself shapes outcomes. Observation is participation. When translated into human experience, this principle suggests something subtle. Awareness does not control reality, but it participates in selecting how reality is perceived and integrated. You see hints of this constantly. Two individuals can encounter identical circumstances, yet experience entirely different realities. One perceives opportunity, another threat. One notices support, another rejection. The external situation may remain similar, but perception reorganizes meaning. Psychology describes this through attentional bias. Neuroscience refers to predictive processing. Emotional states prime the nervous system to highlight certain information while filtering out other data. Awareness continuously selects from overwhelming sensory input. This selection shapes experience. When fear dominates attention, perception naturally scans for danger. Ambiguous events appear threatening. Neutral expressions feel hostile. The world seems tense, even if objective risk has not increased. When trust or curiosity guides attention, different cues emerge. Opportunities, connections, and solutions become more noticeable. The external environment hasn't transformed dramatically. Perception has. This is not wishful thinking. It is cognitive filtering interacting with emotional tone. You are not attracting events magically. You are selecting which aspects of reality become experientially central. Emotions play a powerful role in this selection process. They function as tuning signals. Chronic anxiety narrows cognitive bandwidth. Gratitude broadens it. Compassion increases sensitivity to relational nuance. Stress prioritizes immediate threat detection. Each state reorganizes perception differently. The result is not a different universe, but a different lived version of the same universe. Consider memory as well. Two people recalling the same past event may remember entirely different details. Memory itself is reconstructive, shaped by current emotional context. Each act of remembering subtly reshapes the memory. Observation, again, participates. Understanding this shifts responsibility in a balanced way. It does not imply total authorship over external circumstances. Natural events, social structures, and biological realities remain influential. But it highlights agency in how experience unfolds internally and relationally. You may not control everything that happens, but you participate in how it becomes meaningful. And meaning influences response. Response influences future experience. Gradually, observation becomes less reactive and more intentional. Not forced positivity, but conscious noticing. Not denial of difficulty, but openness to multiple dimensions of experience. This is where coherence begins. And coherence brings us naturally to another profound question. If observation shapes perception, what role does time play in how reality unfolds? Time is often experienced as the most stable dimension of reality. It seems to flow in a single direction. Past behind us, future ahead, the present moment a thin line separating both. This linear perception shapes nearly every aspect of human life, from planning and memory to identity itself. Yet physics increasingly suggests that time may not be as straightforward as it appears. In the quantum realm, particles can display behaviors that challenge our everyday understanding of temporal order. Phenomena such as quantum entanglement show correlations between particles separated by distance without measurable delay. Information does not appear to travel conventionally between them. Instead, the connection seems simultaneous, as if time were less absolute than once assumed. Relativity theory also reshaped our understanding. Time is not fixed. It stretches and compresses depending on gravity and velocity. Clocks tick differently under different conditions. What feels constant locally may not be universal. These insights do not invalidate daily experience. We still schedule meetings, age biologically, and measure duration. But they suggest that time, as experienced psychologically, may be partly constructed by perception. Notice how elastic time feels subjectively. Moments of stress can make minutes feel long and heavy. Periods of joy or creative immersion often pass quickly. Waiting amplifies duration. Flow compresses it. External clock time remains steady, yet lived time fluctuates. Consciousness appears to mediate that experience. Memory provides another clue. When recalling the past, you are not literally traveling backward. The event arises now as reconstruction. Images, emotions, interpretations assembled in present awareness. Similarly, anticipation of the future occurs now as imagination shaped by current expectation. Past and future, experientially, are accessed only through present awareness. This does not mean time is unreal. Rather, it suggests that psychological time, the way you experience continuity, depends heavily on perception. Understanding this can subtly shift anxiety around urgency. Much stress arises from projecting current emotional states into imagined futures. Fear anticipates threat. Hope anticipates possibility. Yet both projections originate in present awareness. When attention stabilizes in the present moment, perception often becomes clearer. Decisions improve. Emotional regulation strengthens. Creativity increases. Not because the future disappears, but because the mind stops fragmenting attention across hypothetical timelines. Presence becomes a stabilizing axis. Interestingly, many contemplative practices across cultures emphasize this. Meditation, breath awareness, artistic immersion, all refine sensitivity to the present field of experience. Scientific research increasingly shows that such practices improve neural coherence, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility. Again, science and contemplative insight begin to converge. The present moment is not merely a transition point between past and future. It is the only experiential location where perception, decision, and transformation occur. Everything meaningful unfolds here. And if observation shapes perception, and perception unfolds in the present, then emotional coherence within this moment may play a crucial role in how reality organizes around you, which leads naturally to the next layer of exploration. How emotion itself interacts with perception, physiology, and the broader field of experience. If observation shapes experience and perception unfolds primarily in the present moment, emotion becomes a central factor in how reality is interpreted and lived. Emotion is often treated as something purely personal, internal chemistry, private feeling, subjective reaction. But research increasingly shows that emotional states influence physiology, cognition, attention, and even interpersonal dynamics in measurable ways. From a scientific standpoint, emotion involves coordinated activity across the nervous system, endocrine responses, and electromagnetic signaling generated by the heart and brain. These signals affect how information is processed, how decisions are made, and how social environments respond to us. The heart, for example, produces a measurable electromagnetic field extending beyond the physical body. While interpretations vary, studies in psychophysiology suggest that emotional coherence, alignment between thought, feeling, and physiological rhythms, correlates with improved cognitive clarity, stress resilience, and interpersonal sensitivity. This doesn't require mystical interpretation. It reflects system regulation. When emotional states are chaotic, chronic stress, unresolved anger, persistent anxiety, Physiological systems tend toward fragmentation. Attention narrows, reaction speed increases, but depth of perception decreases. Decision-making becomes defensive rather than exploratory. Conversely, when emotional states are coherent, calm engagement, curiosity, compassion, grounded confidence, physiological rhythms stabilize. Heart rate variability improves. Neural networks synchronize more effectively. Perception broadens. This has practical consequences. You may notice that when emotionally centered, conversations feel easier, creative solutions appear more accessible. Challenges remain, but they are approached differently. The external world may not have changed, yet interaction with it shifts. Emotion acts as a perceptual filter. It does not dictate reality absolutely, but it influences which aspects become most salient. A stressed nervous system prioritizes threat detection. A regulated nervous system allows for nuance, complexity, and connection. In this sense, emotional awareness becomes a form of cognitive hygiene, not suppression, not forced positivity, but honest recognition. Emotions that are acknowledged tend to integrate. Emotions resisted often persist as background noise affecting perception unconsciously. This is why practices involving breath regulation, mindfulness, or reflective attention often improve emotional stability. They are not escaping reality. They are optimizing the observer. And optimizing the observer changes experience. Importantly, coherence does not mean constant comfort. Difficult emotions remain part of life. Loss, uncertainty, frustration. These are inherent to human existence. Coherence means experiencing them without fragmentation, allowing processing rather than avoidance. When thought and emotion align, when what you feel and what you understand are not in conflict, perception becomes clearer. This clarity influences relationships, creativity, and resilience. Some researchers describe this as heart-brain coherence. Others refer to emotional regulation. Philosophical traditions call it equanimity. Different vocabularies, similar observation. Integrated internal states support more adaptive interaction with reality. And if emotion influences perception, and perception shapes lived reality, another question naturally arises. How does identity itself, the sense of who you are, participate in this dynamic? Because the observer is not only aware, the observer also carries a story. As perception becomes clearer and emotional coherence stabilizes, another layer quietly emerges: identity itself. Most people experience identity as something fixed, a stable sense of who I am, built from memories, roles, beliefs, and personal history. This narrative provides continuity, orientation, and psychological safety. Yet when examined closely, identity appears far more fluid than it initially seems. Your body changes continuously. Cells regenerate, neural pathways reorganize, hormonal balances fluctuate. Even memory, once thought stable, is reconstructive. Each act of remembering subtly reshapes the memory itself based on current emotional context and interpretation. Psychologically, identity functions less like a solid object and more like an ongoing process. You have likely experienced this directly. The version of yourself that appears in professional settings differs slightly from the version present with family, close friends, or in solitude. Emotional states also shift identity temporarily. Confidence, fear, curiosity, fatigue, each state influences perception, decision-making, and behavior. None of these versions are false. They are contextual expressions. From a cognitive science perspective, identity emerges through patterns of attention, interpretation, and repetition. Beliefs about oneself guide perception. Perception reinforces those beliefs. Over time, a relatively stable narrative forms. But stability is not permanence. Quantum physics offers an interesting metaphor here. Matter at fundamental scales is not solid substance, but organized energy patterns, stabilized through interaction. Similarly, identity may be understood as a stabilized pattern of psychological and physiological resonance rather than a fixed entity. When beliefs shift, emotional tone shifts. When emotional tone shifts, perception shifts. When perception shifts, behavior and outcomes shift. Gradually, identity reorganizes. This is why meaningful personal change often feels less like constructing something entirely new and more like revealing aspects that were previously obscured. Old patterns dissolve. New coherence emerges. Importantly, this process does not eliminate individuality. It refines it. You remain uniquely yourself, with personal history, temperament, preferences, and goals. But identification becomes less rigid. Instead of clinging to a single narrative, identity becomes adaptive, responsive, open to revision. This flexibility enhances resilience. People with more fluid identity structures tend to adapt better to change, integrate new information more effectively, and experience less existential anxiety when circumstances shift. Psychological research often refers to this as self-complexity or cognitive flexibility. From a contemplative perspective, something similar appears as the distinction between awareness itself and the content appearing within it. Thoughts, roles, emotions, and memories arise in awareness, but awareness remains the constant background. Recognizing this distinction can reduce over-identification with transient states. You are not only the roles you play, you are also the awareness within which those roles appear. And when identity becomes less rigid, perception becomes less defensive. Curiosity increases. Creativity expands. Relationships deepen because interaction is less filtered by fixed self-concepts. This naturally extends beyond individual identity. Because if personal identity is fluid, what about collective identity? How do shared beliefs, emotional climates, and cultural narratives shape the broader field of human experience? That question leads us to the next layer. The possibility that consciousness is not only individual, but also collective. As identity becomes more fluid and perception less rigid, another dimension gradually reveals itself. The possibility that consciousness is not only individual, but also collective. This idea has appeared throughout history in philosophy, spirituality, sociology, and increasingly in scientific inquiry, though often described in different terms. At a basic biological level, humans are inherently relational beings. Our nervous systems continuously respond to one another. Facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, and subtle emotional cues influence how others feel, often without conscious awareness. This phenomenon is well documented through mirror neuron research, emotional contagion studies, and social neuroscience. Simply put, states of mind spread. A calm person entering a tense environment can stabilize it. A stressed individual can introduce agitation into an otherwise relaxed group. These interactions occur through neurobiology, hormonal signaling, and behavioral feedback loops. But some researchers suggest that the interaction may extend even further. Studies examining global emotional events, large-scale celebrations, tragedies, or shared moments of attention have occasionally shown correlations with fluctuations in environmental electromagnetic measurements. While interpretations remain debated, the data invites continued exploration into whether collective human attention produces measurable field effects. Regardless of interpretation, the experiential dimension is undeniable. Walk into a room where conflict has just occurred. Even without context, the atmosphere often feels heavy. Conversely, environments marked by cooperation or shared purpose tend to feel open and supportive. The body senses these dynamics before the intellect explains them. Culture itself reflects collective consciousness. Shared narratives, values, fears, aspirations all emerge from cumulative human perception over time. Media, education, social norms, and technology both reflect and shape this collective field. In that sense, personal awareness contributes to broader patterns. Each individual emotional state, belief, and behavior participates in social reality. This is not mystical causation, it is systemic interaction. Societies evolve through countless individual actions, perceptions, and emotional climates interacting continuously. The implication is quietly empowering. Personal emotional regulation, clarity of thought, and compassionate interaction do not remain purely private achievements. They influence relational networks, which influence communities, which influence cultural patterns over time. Psychologists often describe this through systems theory. Small changes within a system can propagate through feedback loops, eventually shifting the entire system's behavior. Consider innovation. Many breakthroughs appear nearly simultaneously in different parts of the world. Scientific discoveries, artistic movements, social reforms, often emerging when collective readiness reaches a certain threshold. Individual insight interacts with collective context. Consciousness appears both personal and shared. This understanding also softens the boundary between personal healing and social contribution. Developing emotional coherence, clarity, and awareness is not only self-serving. It stabilizes relational environments, fosters constructive dialogue, and supports collective adaptability. None of this eliminates complexity. Human societies remain diverse, sometimes conflicting, often unpredictable. But recognizing interconnectedness encourages responsibility, balanced with humility. You influence the collective field, and the collective field influences you. Which brings us to an even deeper layer of inquiry. If consciousness is both individual and collective, what lies at the center of awareness itself? Is there a stable reference point beneath all these changing patterns? As exploration expands outward into perception, identity, collective dynamics, and the nature of reality, there often comes a quiet turning point. Attention begins to move inward, not in retreat from the world, but in search of the source from which experience itself arises. This inward movement reveals something surprisingly simple. Behind every thought, emotion, sensation, or memory, there is awareness itself. A silent background that does not fluctuate in the same way the content of experience does. Thoughts change. Emotions rise and fall. Perceptions shift continuously. Yet the fact of being aware remains constant. You can verify this directly. Notice a sound around you. Then notice the awareness hearing that sound. Now notice a thought appearing. Again, awareness is present. The content changes, but awareness remains the stable context. This realization has appeared across disciplines. Psychology refers to metacognition, awareness of awareness. Neuroscience studies attentional regulation. Contemplative traditions describe witnessing consciousness. Philosophy speaks of the observing self. Different vocabularies converge toward the same experiential observation. Awareness is both participant and background. Returning to this center does not require withdrawing from life. It involves noticing the distinction between experience and the awareness experiencing it. When this distinction becomes clearer, several subtle shifts occur. Reactivity often decreases. Emotional experiences still arise, but they are less likely to overwhelm perception completely. Cognitive flexibility increases. Instead of automatic identification with every thought, there is space for observation before reaction. This space enhances resilience. It also improves clarity. Decisions made from a more stable awareness tend to integrate both rational analysis and emotional intelligence. Creativity often increases because attention is less fragmented by internal noise. Interestingly, neuroscience shows that practices cultivating this observing stance, meditation, reflective journaling, focused breathing, correlate with increased activity in brain networks associated with self-regulation and emotional balance. Again, scientific observation and contemplative insight intersect. But beyond performance benefits, something deeper emerges, a sense of continuity beneath changing experience. Identity feels less rigid, less defined solely by circumstance. Awareness becomes a reference point that remains available regardless of external fluctuation. This does not eliminate challenges. Life continues to include uncertainty, loss, success, adaptation. Yet the relationship with these experiences changes. Instead of feeling entirely carried by events, you recognize a dimension of stability within awareness itself. Many describe this as grounding, not detachment, not indifference, but steady presence. From this center, perception becomes less reactive and more responsive. Relationships deepen because listening improves. Creativity expands because attention is less scattered. Emotional processing becomes more efficient because awareness remains engaged without avoidance. And gradually, another realization begins to form. If awareness is the stable center, and all experience appears within it, perhaps the boundary between observer and observed is not as absolute as it once seemed. Which leads naturally to the next exploration. What happens when the distinction between observing and being begins to dissolve? As awareness becomes more stable and familiar, something subtle begins to shift. The distinction between observer and observed, once assumed to be absolute, starts to feel less rigid, not because the external world disappears, but because perception becomes more integrated. Ordinarily, experience feels divided. There is me observing and the world being observed. This division is useful. It allows navigation, decision-making, identity formation. Yet it may not represent the deepest level of reality. At fundamental scales, physics already challenges strict separation. Measurement interacts with what is measured. Observer and system form a relationship rather than existing as completely independent entities. Reality appears relational. On the experiential level, something similar can be noticed. Every perception occurs within awareness. Sounds arise in awareness. Visual impressions arise in awareness. Thoughts about those impressions also arise in awareness. Even the sense of "I am observing" appears as a thought within the same field. Awareness, then, is not separate from experience. It is the context in which experience unfolds. When attention settles into this recognition, perception often becomes less effortful. The constant mental commentary about experience softens. Instead of trying to grasp reality intellectually, there is a directness to perception, a simple noticing. Artists sometimes describe this state as flow. Athletes call it being in the zone. Scientists refer to it as task absorption. Contemplative traditions speak of non-dual awareness. Different contexts, similar phenomenology, reduced separation between observer and activity. Importantly, this does not eliminate individuality or functional distinction. You still make choices, maintain boundaries, fulfill responsibilities. But the psychological sense of isolation often decreases. Interaction feels more continuous, less adversarial. Relationships frequently benefit from this shift. Listening improves because attention is less preoccupied with internal narrative. Empathy increases because defensive identity structures relax slightly. Communication becomes more responsive. Creativity also tends to expand. When the mind stops trying to control every outcome, associative thinking increases. New connections emerge. Solutions appear with less strain. Neuroscience supports aspects of this observation. States of deep focus or contemplative awareness often correlate with decreased activity in the brain's default mode network, regions associated with self-referential thinking. With less internal commentary, perception becomes more immediate. Again, science and lived experience intersect. This convergence does not require adopting metaphysical beliefs. It is accessible through simple observation. Notice how experience feels when attention is fully present compared to when it is fragmented by rumination or anticipation. The difference is often profound. As the boundary between observer and observed softens, reality may feel less like something you confront and more like something you participate in continuously. Not control, not passivity, participation. And from that participatory awareness, a final integration naturally emerges. If observer and observed are deeply connected, what does it mean to live consciously within that understanding? How does daily life change when awareness becomes the primary reference point? That is where integration begins. Understanding the relationship between observer and reality is intellectually stimulating, but its deeper value emerges in daily living. Awareness is not only a philosophical concept or a topic for scientific exploration. It is the medium through which every moment of life unfolds. Conversations, decisions, creativity, relationships, even ordinary routines. Living consciously does not require withdrawing from the world. It involves engaging with it more clearly. One of the first practical shifts is attention itself. Many people move through life on cognitive autopilot. Habits, assumptions, and emotional patterns guide perception without much reflection. This is efficient, but it can limit adaptability. When awareness becomes more active, perception widens. Subtle details, emotional nuances, and alternative responses become visible. This often improves decision-making. Instead of reacting immediately, there is space to observe context, internal states, and possible outcomes. Neuroscience shows that even brief pauses before responding allow regulatory brain networks to engage, reducing impulsive reactions and increasing thoughtful responses. Another practical dimension involves emotional awareness. As discussed earlier, emotions influence perception significantly. Recognizing emotional tone without suppression allows integration. Rather than ignoring discomfort or amplifying it through rumination, awareness acknowledges it, processes it, and allows it to inform action appropriately. This increases psychological flexibility. Flexibility supports resilience. Unexpected events still occur: uncertainty, change, complexity. But when awareness remains stable, adaptation becomes smoother. Stress responses activate when necessary and settle more quickly when the challenge passes. Relationships also benefit. When attention is present, listening improves. Instead of preparing responses while others speak, awareness engages directly with what is being communicated. This reduces misunderstanding and increases empathy. Emotional regulation contributes to constructive dialogue, even during disagreement. Creativity frequently expands under these conditions as well. Many innovative insights emerge during states of relaxed attention, rather than intense cognitive pressure. Activities like walking, reflective pauses, or creative play allow associative networks in the brain to connect information in novel ways. Awareness without strain facilitates integration. Importantly, conscious living does not imply constant serenity. Emotional variability remains natural. Frustration, excitement, uncertainty, and joy all continue to arise. Awareness simply allows these states to be experienced without complete identification. You feel them, but they do not entirely define you. This distinction supports long-term well-being. Research in mindfulness psychology consistently shows correlations between sustained awareness practices and improved emotional regulation, cognitive clarity, and interpersonal effectiveness. Small shifts accumulate. A brief pause before reacting. A moment of noticing breath. Awareness of emotional tone before decision-making. These subtle adjustments gradually influence perception, behavior, and relational patterns. Over time, life feels less reactive and more participatory. Not controlled, not random, responsive. And as awareness becomes a stable reference point, a final realization begins to settle quietly. Reality may not simply be something you encounter. It may be something continuously revealed through the quality of your attention. Which brings us to the closing integration. Consciousness not only observing reality, but recognizing itself through it. As this exploration comes full circle, one insight begins to stand quietly at the center of everything we've considered. Consciousness is not only observing reality. It may be reality recognizing itself through experience. This idea does not require metaphysical belief. It arises naturally when you look closely at experience. Everything you have ever perceived, every sight, sound, thought, emotion, memory, or anticipation, has appeared within awareness. You have never stepped outside it. Awareness has always been the constant background of your life. Yet most of the time, attention focuses on what appears within awareness rather than awareness itself. The movement of experience captures attention, events, responsibilities, emotions, ambitions. This is natural. Functional life depends on engagement, but occasionally, attention turns inward and recognizes the silent context behind all activity. That recognition often brings an unexpected sense of simplicity. Nothing external necessarily changes. The world remains complex, sometimes unpredictable. Responsibilities continue, relationships evolve, challenges still arise, but the relationship with experience becomes less strained. Awareness provides continuity, even as circumstances fluctuate. This continuity reduces existential tension. Instead of feeling entirely defined by events, you begin to notice a stable dimension of presence underlying them. Psychology sometimes refers to this as self as context, the observing dimension of identity distinct from transient mental content. Philosophy describes it as consciousness reflecting upon itself. Neuroscience studies the regulatory effects of sustained awareness. Different disciplines, similar observation. From this perspective, reality stops feeling purely external. It becomes relational. Experience unfolds through interaction between environment, physiology, cognition, emotion, and awareness. None operate in isolation. Participation replaces detachment. This does not grant absolute control over life. External factors, social systems, biological realities, and chance events remain influential. But awareness influences how these factors are perceived, integrated, and responded to, which in turn shapes future experience. Gradually, attention becomes more intentional. You notice emotional tone sooner. You recognize cognitive patterns earlier. You pause before reacting more often. These small adjustments accumulate, subtly reshaping relationships, decisions, creativity, and resilience. Living consciously then becomes less about achieving perfection and more about maintaining clarity. Not constant certainty, not uninterrupted calm, but sustained presence. From that presence, life often feels more coherent. Challenges become information rather than threats. Opportunities become visible sooner. Relationships deepen through attentive listening. Creativity flows with less friction. And perhaps most importantly, curiosity returns. Curiosity about experience itself. Curiosity about awareness. Curiosity about how perception shapes reality moment by moment. If this exploration resonates with you, continue observing, not just the world, but the awareness through which the world appears. That simple act often reveals more than abstract explanation ever could. And if these reflections supported your understanding, consider staying connected with this ongoing exploration. Conversations about consciousness, perception, and reality are continually evolving, scientifically, philosophically, and experientially. Because the journey is not toward a final answer, it is toward clearer observation. And in that observation, consciousness quietly recognizes itself.